How a teenage gunner's broken sight actually helped him shoot down 6 Messerschmitts, 25,000 feet over Nazi Germany. The B-17 Flying Fortress is screaming as flak bursts turn the sky into a graveyard of black smoke. Inside the tail turret, a 19-year-old gunner is trapped in a frozen glass cage. Suddenly, a swarm of Messerschmitt Bf-109s dives out of the sun. He reaches for his sights, only to find the glass shattered and the crosshairs gone. He's blind in a world of lead. But instead of panicking, he does the unthinkable. He stops aiming with his eyes and starts aiming with his soul. Before the mission is over, 6 German fighters will fall from the sky, victims of a broken sight and a kid who refused to miss. This is the story of how a mechanical failure created an aerial ace. Part 1. The Flying Fortress. To the world below, the B-17 Flying Fortress was a majestic silver queen of the skies. But to the 10 men inside, it was a vibrating, freezing metal tube filled with the smell of burnt oil and oxygen masks. And for the tail gunner, the man they called Tail End Charlie, it was a prison of glass and steel. Imagine being 19 years old. Just a year ago, you were worried about high school prom or fixing your father's tractor. Now you are kneeling, not sitting, but kneeling in a space no bigger than a cardboard box at the very end of a plane. You are separated from the rest of your crew by 30 feet of empty fuselage. If the plane breaks in half, you are the first to go. If a Messerschmitt attacks from the rear, you are the first thing they see. At 25,000 feet, the temperature inside the tail turret drops to 40 degrees below zero. It's so cold that if you touch the metal with your bare skin, it tears your flesh off. Your breath freezes inside your mask, forming ice crystals that threaten to choke you. You are breathing bottled oxygen, and the roar of the 4 Wright Cyclone engines is a constant, bone-shaking thunder. In front of you are 2.50 caliber Browning machine guns. Between them sits your eye, the N6 lead computing gun sight. In 1944, this was the pinnacle of technology. It was a complex mechanical brain that was supposed to do the math for you. It calculated the wind, the speed of your B-17, and the predicted path of the enemy fighter. All you had to do was keep the tiny glowing dot, the reticle, on the enemy's wingtips. But the N6 was a delicate instrument of glass and mirrors. It was designed for a laboratory, not for a vibrating fortress being hammered by flak and frozen by the Arctic winds of the stratosphere. The teenage gunner's life depended on that glowing dot. Without it, he was just a kid throwing rocks at a swarm of hornets. He had been trained for months to trust the sight, to let the machine do the thinking. Trust the reticle, his instructors had told him. The sight is your god. Without it, you are dead. But as the formation of B-17s crossed the border into Germany, the god in the tail turret was about to fail. The Luftwaffe pilots knew the B-17's weakness. They knew that if they could take out the tail gunner, the entire rear of the formation was defenseless. They called it the Sting. They would dive from the sun, 600 miles per hour of screaming steel and 20mm cannons, aiming right for that little glass cage. Our gunner waited. He gripped the spade handles of his Brownings, his fingers numb despite the heated gloves. He stared through the N6, watching the horizon for the black specks that meant death was coming. Then came the jolt. A burst of flak exploded just yards from the tail. The entire plane bucked like a wounded beast. Shrapnel sprayed the fuselage, and the extreme vibration sent a shockwave through the turret. He looked at his gun sight. The glowing dot flickered. It danced wildly across the glass for a second, and then snap. The internal mirrors, shattered by the vibration and the brutal cold, gave way. The reticle vanished. The complex math of the U.S. Army Air Corps was now just a collection of broken glass. In that moment, the teenage gunner was no longer a high-tech warrior of the future. He was a 19-year-old boy in a frozen cage, staring at a swarm of 30 German fighters closing in at 400 miles per hour, and he had no way to aim his guns. He was blind, and the Luftwaffe was hungry. Part 2. The Disaster. The silence inside the tail turret was more terrifying than the roar of the engines. For a split second, Johnny, the 19-year-old gunner, stared at the empty glass of his N6 sight as if waiting for a miracle. He tapped the casing with his gloved hand, hoping the glowing reticle would flicker back to life. Nothing. Only the jagged reflection of his own wide, terrified eyes stared back at him. Outside, the world was exploding. The black forest of German flak was reaching up to claw the B-17s out of the sky. Then, through the intercom, the navigator's voice crackled, high-pitched with adrenaline. "Bandits! 6 o'clock! Hi, they're coming in fast." Johnny's heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. 6 o'clock meant they were coming straight for him. He looked up. Out of the blinding glare of the sun, 4 Messerschmitt Bf-109s were diving. To them, the tail of the B-17 was the bullseye. They looked like predatory sharks slicing through a sea of clouds, their wings flickering with the deadly spark of 20mm cannons. In that moment, Johnny felt naked. He had been taught to use the sight to calculate deflection, the complex geometry of shooting at a target, moving hundreds of miles per hour while you yourself are moving just as fast. Without the sight, the math was impossible. His brain scrambled, trying to remember the diagrams from the training manuals back in Texas. If the target is at 400 yards and moving at a 30-degree angle, you must lead by 3 radials. To hell with the radials. Johnny screamed, though no one could hear him over the wind. The first Messerschmitt was closing the distance. 500 yards. 400 yards. Johnny squeezed the triggers. The dual Brownings bucked in his hands, the .50 caliber rounds spitting fire with a deafening thud, thud, thud. He missed by a mile. The German fighter zoomed past, so close that Johnny could see the pilot's goggles and the black crosses on the wings. The slipstream of the enemy plane rocked the B-17's tail like a toy. Johnny realized with a jolt of pure terror that if he didn't change something, the next pass would be his last. He took a deep breath of the thin, metallic-tasting oxygen. His eyes, stinging from the cold and the cordite smoke, caught something. It was the tracers. Every 5th round in his ammunition belt was a tracer, a bullet filled with a magnesium compound that burned bright red as it flew. In the shadow of his broken sight, those tracers were leaving a glowing red trail through the sky. Suddenly, something clicked in Johnny's mind. It was a memory, not from the Air Corps, but from home. He remembered being 7 years old, standing in his backyard with a garden hose, trying to hit a moving tin can. He hadn't used a sight then. He had watched the stream of water, adjusting his aim based on where the water hit. "It's a hose," he whispered to himself. "Don't look at the gun. Look at the stream." He stopped trying to find the broken crosshairs. He stopped trying to do the math. He leaned his head back, looking past the shattered N6, staring directly at the empty space where the enemy was about to be. 2 more Bf-109s were banking for a stern attack. They were coming in dead level, confident that the tail gunner was either dead or incompetent. They didn't know that the boy in the cage had just stopped being a technician and had started being a hunter. Johnny waited. He felt the vibration of the B-17, the rhythm of the engines, the sway of the tail. He became part of the machine. When the lead Messerschmitt entered his field of vision, he didn't think. He just poured the fire. The red line of tracers arched through the air, a whip of fire 20,000 feet up. Johnny watched the stream, saw it falling short, and instinctively flicked his wrist to lead the target. The stream of lead connected. The .50 caliber rounds tore into the Messerschmitt's engine cowling. Sparks flew. A thick plume of black smoke erupted from the German's nose. The fighter flicked onto its back and spiraled toward the clouds below. One down. But there was no time to cheer. The sky was still full of wolves, and they were beginning to realize that the blind gunner in the tail was anything but helpless. Johnny's broken sight was no longer a disaster. It was a liberation. He was no longer staring at a tiny glowing dot. He was staring at the whole world, and he was ready to paint it red. Part 3. Instinct over technology. The first Messerschmitt was a fireball trailing smoke into the abyss. But the sky over Germany didn't offer a moment for celebration. The Luftwaffe was now angry. To the German pilots of JG-26 veterans who had fought over London and the Eastern Front, a B-17 with a lone tail gunner was supposed to be a Sitzendente, a sitting duck. But something was wrong with this particular fortress. Usually, a gunner with a lead computing sight would fire in short, calculated bursts, trying to trap the fighter in his crosshairs. Johnny wasn't doing that. He was painting the sky. Without the glowing reticle of the N6 to distract him, Johnny's peripheral vision opened up. He could see the entire formation of fighters, not just the one he was supposed to be aiming at. He saw the twinkle of their wings as they banked, the slight shift in their trajectory before they committed to a dive. The second and third Messerschmitts came in as a para-rot formation. They split, one high, one low, trying to overwhelm Johnny's focus. In the training manuals, this was a nightmare scenario. The N6 sight would have required Johnny to pick one target, lock in the range, and ignore the other. But Johnny didn't pick. He became a conduit for the two Brownings. He swung the turret with the fluid grace of a dancer. He watched the red stream of his tracers. When the first German pilot dipped his wing to begin his strafing run, Johnny didn't wait for a lock. He flicked a stream of lead 2 inches ahead of the fighter's nose. The German flew straight into the wall of fire. The .50 caliber rounds shredded the cockpit glass. The plane didn't just burn. It disintegrated, too. Before the second fighter could react, Johnny pivoted. He didn't look through the shattered glass of the sight. He looked around it. He saw the second 109 closing in from the low right. Using the garden hose technique, he walked his fire across the sky. He saw the tracers splashing against the German's wing root like red water against a wall. The wing folded upward, snapped by the sheer kinetic energy, and the fighter spun out of control. 3. Inside the B-17, the rest of the crew heard the non-stop thunder of Johnny's guns. The intercom was filled with his heavy, rhythmic breathing and the clatter of spent brass casings hitting the turret floor. "Johnny, what's going on back there?" The pilot yelled. "You're burning through ammo." "Don't worry about the ammo," Johnny barked back, his voice raw. "Just keep this bird steady." The truth was, the broken sight had given Johnny an unfair advantage. The N6 was a tunnel. It forced a gunner to look at a 2D projection on a piece of glass. By losing the sight, Johnny was back in a 3D world. He was feeling the lid, Ji-yun, not as a mathematical formula, but as a physical distance. It wasn't math anymore. It was geometry written in fire. I could see where the bullets were going to land before I even pulled the triggers. It was like I was throwing the lead with my own hands, Johnny's later recollection. The fourth and fifth kills happened in a blur of gray-blue camouflage and tracers. The German pilots, now panicked, were making slashing attacks, diving at high speeds and pulling away. But they were predictable. Johnny caught the fourth as it pulled up, its belly exposed for a fraction of a second, a fatal mistake. The fuel tank ignited instantly. The fifth took a burst straight to the tail surfaces, losing its elevators and tumbling into a flat spin. 4, 5, the sky was becoming a graveyard. The Luftwaffe formation was breaking apart. They couldn't understand how a single gunner, trapped in a tiny cage, was swatting them out of the air with such terrifying precision. They thought he had some new secret allied technology. They didn't know he was just a 19-year-old kid with a broken piece of glass and a garden hose instinct. But one German remained. A Schwartz 1-inch, black 1, the leader. He had watched his students die, and he wasn't going to let this American Amos get away. He pulled his Messerschmitt into a high climbing turn, positioned himself directly into the sun, and prepared for the final lethal dive. Johnny squinted against the glare. His eyes were burning, his hands were cramped, and his ammunition was dangerously low. The broken sight sat between them like a useless relic. The final duel was about to begin, and this time, it wasn't just about instinct, it was about who would blink first in the face of certain death. Part 4, The Final Duel. The sky was no longer a battlefield. It was a stage, and the audience was the silent frozen clouds 5 miles below. Johnny squinted through his salt-stained goggles. His breath was coming in ragged, shallow gasps. Somewhere up there, hidden in the blinding white furnace of the sun, was the Black One. A Luftwaffe ace. A man who didn't make mistakes. A man who had probably spent more hours in a cockpit than Johnny had spent in high school. The German pilot was playing a deadly game of patience. He knew the B-17's tail was dangerous, but he also knew the gunner's weaknesses: fatigue, low ammunition, and the glare. Suddenly Johnny saw it, not a plane but a flicker. A glint of light reflecting off a polished canopy. The Messerschmitt was diving, coming down like a lightning bolt at a 60-degree angle. This was the deadly high-6 attack. Here he comes. Johnny yelled over the intercom, but his voice was a dry croak. The German pilot opened up from long range. He didn't fire in bursts. He sent a steady stream of 20mm cannon shells toward the tail. BOOM. Boom. The rounds exploded against the B-17 stabilizers, sending jagged shards of aluminum flying past Johnny's head. One shell clipped the corner of the tail turret, shattering what was left of the side windows. The cold hit Johnny like a physical blow. The wind howling into the turret was deafening. Oil from a damaged hydraulic line sprayed across the broken N6 gunsight, turning the useless glass into a blurred, greasy mess. He was truly blind now. He couldn't see the Messerschmitt. He could only see a dark, blurred shape moving through a haze of oil and ice. But Johnny didn't panic. He did something that defied all military logic. He closed his eyes for a fraction of a second to clear his vision, and then he opened them, not to look at the sight, but to look at the vibration. He could feel the German's engine. He could feel the air pressure changing as the fighter closed the gap. He grabbed the spade handle so hard his knuckles turned white. "You want me?" Johnny hissed through his oxygen mask. "Come and get me, you son of a bitch." The German ace, confident in his kill, flew closer and closer, waiting for the American to spray his last bullets in a panic. But Johnny waited. He waited until the blurred shape filled the entire rear view. He waited until he could practically smell the exhaust of the Daimler-Benz engine. 300 yards, 200 yards, 150 yards. Johnny squeezed. The Browning screamed one last time. Because he wasn't using a sight, Johnny didn't aim at where the German was. He aimed at where the German had to go to avoid a collision. He pre-painted a wall of lead in the sky. The tracers didn't look like a hose anymore. They looked like a solid red bar of light. The German ace tried to break away at the last microsecond, pulling a violent high G-turn to the left. He flew right into Johnny's trap. The .50 caliber armor-piercing rounds caught the Messerschmitt right in the belly, the unarmored underside of the fuselage. The engine exploded. The canopy shattered. For a heartbeat, Johnny saw the German pilot's face, a mask of pure shock before the entire plane vanished in a ball of orange flame and black soot. The explosion was so close it rocked the B-17 violently. Johnny was thrown against the side of his cage, his head ringing. Silence. Johnny stared out into the empty sky. The Black One was gone. There were no more flickers in the sun. No more black specks on the horizon. He looked down at his ammo belts. There were exactly 3 rounds left in the right gun. The left was empty. "Tail to pilot," Johnny said, his voice trembling. I think I got him." "That's 6. There was a long pause on the intercom. Then, the pilot's voice came through, filled with a mix of disbelief and awe. 6, Johnny? You just shot down a whole goddamn squadron. Hang on, kid. We're taking you home." As the B-17 turned toward the English Channel, Johnny slumped back in his seat. The broken N6 sight sat in front of him, a useless piece of junk covered in oil and frost. He realized then that the machine hadn't failed him, The machine had been holding him back. He had survived by letting go. He had won by trusting the only thing the Germans couldn't calculate, the raw, unyielding instinct of a boy who refused to die. The teenage ace had just made history, and he had done it all while being technically blind. Part 5. The Human Element. When the B-17, riddled with over 200 holes and trailing a thin stream of oil, finally bounced onto the runway at its base in England, the ground crew didn't cheer. They stared in silence. They had seen flying fortresses come back in pieces before, but this one looked like it had been through a meat grinder. As the engines coughed and died, Johnny crawled out of the tail turret. He was shaking, covered in a mix of hydraulic fluid, frost, and the black soot of spent gunpowder. He didn't look like a hero. He looked like a boy who had seen the end of the world and somehow walked back from it. But then, the debriefing began. The intelligence officers sat in a dimly lit room, their jaws dropping as Johnny and the crew recounted the mission. 6? One officer asked, leaning forward. You're claiming 6 confirmed kills in a single pass? That's not just an ace. That's an ace in a day. To confirm the kills, the ground crew went to the tail turret to retrieve the film from the gun camera. But when the chief engineer climbed into the tiny cage, he let out a gasp. Sir, you need to see this, he called out to the colonel. They looked at the N6 lead computing site. It was a wreck. The mirrors were shattered, the internal gears were jammed by frozen oil, and the glass was so blurred you couldn't see a silhouette through it, let alone a reticle. Son, the colonel said, looking at Johnny, how in the name of God did you hit anything with this piece of junk? It's been broken since the first 10 minutes of the flight. Johnny looked at his oil-stained hands and then at the broken machine. I didn't use it, sir, he said simply. It was in my way. So I just looked at where the fire was going. The military engineers were baffled. They spent weeks analyzing the mission. According to their slide rules and ballistics charts, what Johnny had done was mathematically highly improbable. The N6 was supposed to be the only way to achieve that kind of accuracy. But they missed the point that every veteran pilot eventually learns. Technology is a crutch, and sometimes, a crutch keeps you from running. By trying to follow the glowing dot, other gunners were essentially thinking about the shot. They were reacting to a machine's interpretation of the enemy. But by having his sight destroyed, Johnny had been forced to feel the shot. He had bypassed the mechanical brain and reconnected with his own ancient predatory instincts. He didn't need a computer to tell him where the enemy was. He had become the computer. Johnny didn't stay in the Air Corps for a career. Like the mechanic Sarge we talked about before, Johnny eventually went home. He received the Silver Star and a handful of other medals, but he tucked them away in a shoebox under his bed. He went back to a small town, maybe became a carpenter or a teacher, and never bragged about the day he swatted 6 of the Luftwaffe's finest out of the sky with a broken toy. But the legend of the broken sight ace lived on in the training manuals of the Air Force. It became a lesson taught to every new generation of fighter pilots. Learn your instruments, but never let them replace your eyes. As we look back at the history of World War II, we often get lost in the specs, who had the faster plane, the bigger gun, or the better radar. But stories like Johnny's remind us of the human element. We are more than the machines we build. We are a species that, when pushed to the edge, can find a way to win even when every tool in our hands is broken. Johnny didn't shoot down 6 Messerschmitts because he had the best technology in the world. He shot them down because, in the freezing silence of that tail turret, he realized that the only thing he truly needed to survive was the one thing the Germans couldn't break: himself. The broken sight of Johnny isn't just a story about a lucky kid. It's a testament to the power of human intuition over mechanical perfection. And in an age where we rely more on AI and automation, perhaps we should remember the boy in the cage, the one who saw more clearly when his eyes were blind.